Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video we're going to be looking at society under Elizabeth I. This is designed for A-level history, in particular the AQA unit 1C. Now the specification tells us a couple of things really. Well, first of all, there's one of the key questions, which is how did English society and economy change and with what effects? And then there's the two bullet points that are relevant to this in the Elizabeth part of the spec. So society, continuity and change, problems in the region, social discontent and rebellions. And then there's the economic bit, economic development, trade, exploration and colonization, prosperity and depression. So in today's video, I'm going to look at the society part of that, but obviously the two things are very closely interlinked and questions asked often combine the two. There will be an upcoming video in which I will look at the economy. I'm going to look at continuity and change in society, and to do this I'm going to look at different stratas of Elizabethan society. So the nobility, to start off with, remained the dominant class in Elizabethan England. So underneath the monarch herself, these were the wealthiest and most powerful people in the land. The number of hereditary peers was declining, and Elizabeth was careful not to create any more dukes after the four ducal titles had met bloody ends in various circumstances, 1547 to 1572. So there is a degree of continuity there in terms of the dominance of this group, and we do talk about new money and we talk about new men in Elizabethan England and people kind of making their way. But it's very important to note that really the kind of hierarchy of society pretty much stays in place, and therefore the dominance of the aristocracy doesn't go away. The change in some ways is about not only the loss of dukes, but also really about the way that this group sought prestige. So, and again, this might well be in part due to the fact we've got a female monarch, and therefore maybe the old courtly pursuits and the group surrounding the king, as it had been in the past, was slightly different. And the big change really was the building of prestige building projects, these enormous houses which you still see dotted around the English countryside, and part of the motivation was to ensure that you had a residence suitable to house the Queen should she choose to visit you on a royal progress, and being visited on a royal progress remained a kind of a really important thing to happen, and something that would really mark you and your family out. Examples of the building of Burghley House and Wilton House. So really maybe the nature and the prestige of the aristocracy hadn't, or nobility hadn't really changed, but maybe some of the ways in which they displayed it had, and the advent of kind of new industries and things like that. I mean, we see a lot of these noble houses with glass windows and things like that. So that again is part of the things that are changing. Now the term gentry continued to lack a precise definition. It therefore embraced a very large social group. These were the kind of the rising group, the landowners, some of whom were becoming incredibly wealthy. They really are still probably in the same strata that they were before, where they don't have the names and the titles and the kind of lineage and history that the nobility have. So no matter what wealth levels they reach, they're never quite as important. But they are really increasing their standing, and the group of them that was seriously wealthy would continue to increase, and a lot of this group had made serious money out of gaining larger amounts of property with the dissolution of the monarchy, dissolution of the monasteries early on, buying of monastic land. Because of the inflation and the massive increase in the value of land, their incomes increased dramatically, especially after 1570. And we start to see with this group the beginning of a consumer society, and a lot of demand from luxuries coming from abroad, building of impressive buildings and homes, glass windows, all those kind of things. And so the gentry really rise during this period in terms of their wealth. That wealth isn't necessarily a gateway into the group above, though there was a degree of intermarriage, and the group is maybe slightly changing in terms of its nature, away from just the kind of the slightly less grand landowners to groups such as merchants and professionals, who were probably again associated with this class or part of this class. Now, amongst the commoners, particularly in rural areas, you can argue that through the Elizabethan period, very little differed from the start of the century. They did very similar jobs, they lived in very similar housing, etc. They had not very much spare time, not very much spare income. So in some ways you could look at this period as one of kind of general continuity for the ordinary person in Tudor England. But there was change happening. So during the Elizabethan period, the gap between rich and poor widened very, very dramatically, and the poorer sections of society found themselves vulnerable to enclosure and persistent decline in real wages. Inflation was a real problem. Again, I'll look at this in more detail in the economy video. For many, degrees of urbanisation, increased enclosure alongside sheep farming, along with changing methods to help the poor and new opportunities in industry, led to significant changes in their lives. So you would, amongst the commoners, see some who continued to live and work in the same village that their families had lived and worked in for many generations, and their life wouldn't look enormously different in 1603 to what it had done in the 1540s or even earlier. But there were some who, due to enclosure and the advent of sheep farming and various other changes taking place, ended up leaving where they had been and moving into urban areas. Now, the vast majority of urbanisation involved people moving to London. London was by far and away the biggest urban centre. So, and then you also saw those who fell into real dire straits because of the change in economic circumstances, and their lives were dramatically changed for the worse. So amongst the commoners, there were those who thrived and started to climb the social ladder, found new and interesting and different work and profitable work in places like London. There were those who fell desperately into poverty, and there were many that were somewhere in between. But this was definitely economically a very challenging period, again, especially as I mentioned, because of inflation. Next, I'm going to look at some of the problems in the regions, and I'm going to look at several of these. I'm going to start with the border with Scotland. Now, this is England's only direct frontier with a land frontier with a foreign nation. And it was divided into 3 marches for security: the east, middle and west. And Elizabeth really was left with quite a difficult decision. Did she appoint leading local magnates who she didn't necessarily trust, and possibly with good reason, as we'll see with the Northern Rebellion, but would do that because she could gain local support, and that's the way traditionally things have been done? Or should she appoint a trusty outsider or local person with lower birth? And again, here this combines with our changes in society, where the Tudors, Elizabeth included, had a tendency at times to look to the gentry rather than the nobility, where, again, by promoting people, they would owe their loyalty to the monarch rather than having a power base of their own. But either of these choices in either part of B would not have the same control over the local people that a kind of a long-standing member of the nobility, a local magnate, would have. Now, Elizabeth went for option B. Her relative, Lord Hunsdon, became Warden of the East. The governor of Berwick-upon-Twine was made Warden of the Middle. And so we see it going away from the traditional magnates of the North. This causes a number of problems. First of all, some of the southern aristocrats who were sent up resented being posted in the inhospitable north. Also, there was frequent issues in this area of corruption, factionalism, and this could have all proved to be rather critical if the succession in 1603 had been more strongly contested. And obviously the biggest part that comes out of this as well is Elizabeth putting the northern earls' noses out of joint, which becomes a kind of significant problem in the Northern Rebellion in 1569. In the north, more generally, you had the 6 northern counties under the jurisdiction of the Council of the North, based in York. The Council of the North was then answerable to the Privy Council. The Council of the North was important because it acted on the monarch's behalf in an area far away from London. Some of Elizabeth's councillors regarded the Earl of Sussex, who was in charge of the council, as a failure because of the Northern Rebellion. Again, this is this area, the north, the borders. These are areas where maybe Elizabeth could have been more sensitive and made more use of the Northern Earls, or maybe the Northern Rebellion proves that she was right not to trust that group and to place her trust more in the hand of Sussex, though Sussex is not successful and is replaced with the Earl of Huntingdon in 1572. Now, Huntingdon was a Puritan, and he used the Council of the North to attack Catholicism in the northern strongholds. So here we see Elizabeth taking a more disciplinarian, a kind of a stronger kind of take on how to control the north, and we've seen the north as a real problem area, not only for Elizabeth but for her father before her with the Pilgrimage of Grace, and therefore the idea that the Tudors have a really strong hold on the north is probably far from the truth, and therefore we see them often having to rather brutally suppress the north to ensure their power, their hold over it, and this hold becomes stronger through the strong actions of the Earl of Huntingdon after 1572. Another region that was really significant was Wales and the Marches, so the Marches are the border area, and this area was generally one that was seen to have close ties with the Tudors. You can think back to Jasper Tudor, if you go all the way back to Henry VII, and was generally seen as far less of a problem than the north. And the border area, the Marches area, the border between England and Wales was seen as far less of a problem than the border area with Scotland, understandably so. Obviously, Wales was part of the Tudor kingdom, while Scotland wasn't. The Council of Wales and the Marches was less politically important than the Council of the North. And the council remained in operation, but the Welsh language disappeared in government. Again, we can see this move towards centralisation, possibly. The Bible and the prayer book, however, were still available in Welsh. Poverty was a real problem in Wales, and there was a degree of discontent reflected, for example, in the number of Welshmen implicated in the Essex Rebellion, which takes place right towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. So not everything is rosy in Wales, but again, less of a problem than the north. The next region I'm going to look at is Ireland. And this is most definitively the most difficult region for Elizabeth to control during her reign. During Elizabeth's reign, new arrivals came into Ireland from England, often Protestants sent there by Elizabeth, Protestant men going over seeking to make quick fortunes. They often clashed with the Gaelic Irish and also the more established English settlers. So this new wave of settlement into Ireland caused real division. Because of the clashes and the issues that this caused, martial law was imposed frequently, increasing the level of resentment from the Irish population. There were rebellions, 1569 to 73, coinciding with the Northern Rebellion and the early plots like the Ridolfi plot and also Elizabeth's excommunication. And then we see another rebellion, 1579 to 82, again at a point where tensions are high with the Spanish and issues in the Netherlands. The second one was dealt with by the Lord Deputy of Ireland, Lord Grey of Wilton, with great brutality. So again, we see this idea of suppression, a tactic used by Elizabeth in the north of England and then also being used in Ireland. However, in Ireland, this brutality, this suppression wouldn't work to the same extent, and a much larger rebellion would come later. And the most significant rebellion against Elizabeth in Ireland was led by Hugh O'Neill, who Elizabeth had made the Earl of Tyrone in 1585. He rebels 10 years later in 1595 in what is known as the Tyrone Rebellion. And the Earl of Tyrone was motivated by a combination of different factors, culture, personal ambition, religion. And really, we can see him seeing the opportunity as England's ongoing war with Spain. Elizabeth sought a truce, knowing that the Spanish would attempt to exploit the situation and bolster their position in the Anglo-Spanish War. Tyrone gained assistance with clans such as the O'Donnells and the Maguires, and Tyrone's base was in Ulster, but the rebellion spread beyond Ulster because of the link with these other clans. So this becomes a really large-scale and significant rebellion, which the Spanish tried to exploit. And we see this with the including of an Irish contingent in the Second Armada of 1596. Again, this armada proved to be unsuccessful. It was a clear signal of Spanish intentions and the significance of this rebellion in Ireland. An English force was then defeated at the Battle of Yellowford in August 1598, and the area beyond the Pale, and the Pales are kind of an area surrounding Dublin, but it was quite clear that beyond that area, England was just not in control anymore. So Elizabeth's control over this region, the country of Ireland, was very, very tenuous at this point. And it looked like Tyrone was on the verge of setting up an independent Catholic Ireland with Spanish support. Now Elizabeth sent one of her key favourites, the Earl of Essex, to Ireland in 1599, giving him the title of Lord Lieutenant. This proved to be a complete disaster. The Earl of Essex started disobeying Elizabeth's orders almost straight away. She told him not to knight any of his officers. He got to Ireland, knighted a load of his officers. He had this massive force. He was told to go and fight Tyrone, but he didn't go to Ulster. He stayed in Leinster and Munster and seemed to find every excuse under the sun not to go and fight Tyrone. Again, Elizabeth then orders him north again, but instead of when he meets Tyrone confronting him in battle, he instead has a secret meeting with him and signs a truce, again explicitly against Elizabeth's orders. Elizabeth then orders Essex to come back to court. He refuses. He does eventually come back to court, and there's a huge to-do about it, and he's disgraced, and again he ultimately ends up going into rebellion himself with the Essex Rebellion. The truce Essex signs with Tyrone expires. Tyrone moves south to Kinsale, and where he hoped to link up with the Spanish army, and this kind of is the high point of his power. It looks like Ireland is lost. But we then see English rule being re-established under the Lord Lieutenants Mountjoy and Carew. Carew secured Cork and gradually recaptured most of Munster. Mountjoy pushed Tyrone back into Ulster. O'Neill's forces were saved from complete destruction by the landing in Kinsale of 3,000 Spanish troops in 1601. The English had been triumphant over O'Donnell, one of the key clans, and had forced him to flee with the Spanish. And then eventually Tyrone made peace with Mountjoy in 1603. What Tyrone didn't know was that Elizabeth was already dead at this point. Mountjoy actually offered Tyrone really good terms, particularly considering the problems that he caused. And this was basically so he could get back and meet the new King James and make sure he had a significant place in his government and in his standing. So Ireland was a real problem, but eventually we see control being re-established. In terms of social discontent and rebellion, obviously we've seen Tyrone's rebellion already. We're now going to look at the Northern Rebellion. First of all, starting with the causes. So the first cause was religious. There was a clear religious enthusiasm for Catholicism amongst the leaders and many of the ordinary participants. Mass was said in Durham Cathedral. So again, and the main reason given for the rebellion was religious ones. There was politics. The Northern Earls considered themselves to be dishonest, having been displaced from their traditional aristocratic role of controlling northern government and controlling that particular region, and then being supplanted by, and they considered lower than themselves, and by southern aristocrats being moved in to take the key roles in the defence from Scotland and the Council of the North. The third reason given is that it was a courtly conspiracy, that there was this idea that Norfolk should marry Mary Queen of Scots. They should then, the Northern Earls would help then restore Mary Queen of Scots to the Scottish throne, and then the children of Norfolk and Mary Queen of Scots would be undoubtedly the heirs apparent to Elizabeth's throne, and so eventually they would that would be who would be established on the English throne, either Norfolk and Mary or Norfolk and Mary's children, depending on when Elizabeth was to die. Now the plan triggered a volcanic response from Elizabeth when she discovered it. Norfolk completely backs him out, chickens out, and though that's not enough to save him ultimately, and again, all of these things play a part. The social and economic issues, again, this is a difficult period in a lot of areas economically, and so there was a lot of discontent amongst the ordinary people. And as we've seen, many ordinary people were seeing their standard of living going down rather than up. So the rebellion began on the 9th of November 1569, and the rebels, led by the two Northern Earls, Westmoreland and Northumberland, marched on Durham. They seized the city on the 14th of November and heard mass in the cathedral. From Durham, the rebels marched to Branham Moor. Hearing of a large force was being raised by the Earl of Sussex, the rebels abandoned their plans to besiege York and instead captured Barnard Castle. Obviously, not just checking their eyesight at that point, but again, a step backwards maybe from taking York, but Barnard Castle would give them a stronghold. And again, potentially a mistake, the rebels did not march south in an attempt to pressurise the government. Sussex marched out from York on the 13th of December with 10,000 men, followed by 12,000 men under Baron Clinton. The Earls disbanded their forces and fled over the border into Scotland. So really, the first sign of real strength from royal forces, the kind of Northern Rebellion kind of melts away. A month later, the Northumberland's cousin restarted the rebellion in Cumberland, only for his forces to be heavily defeated just east of Carlisle by a royal force under the Queen's cousin, Lord Hunsdon. So a very potentially dangerous rebellion doesn't come to a huge amount, and part of this might well have been Norfolk backing out. Part of it, I think, it was the sign of strength and determination from Elizabeth, and part of it appears to be poor leadership from Westmoreland and Northumberland. So what were the consequences of this rebellion? Well, Northumberland was captured and turned over to Elizabeth in 1572, and she beheaded him in York. Westmoreland escaped to Flanders, where he later on died completely impoverished. The Duke of Norfolk was at first imprisoned, then pardoned, and then executed following connections to the Ridolfi plot in 1571. And treason charges against Norfolk included comforting English rebels that stirred the rebellion in the north, since they have fled out of the realm. So, although he was initially pardoned, it was clear that he was never forgiven for his part in the rebellion. Altogether, 600 supporters of Mary were executed, whilst many others fled into exile. And so again, we see this rather brutal suppression of Elizabeth in response to discontent and rebellion, and in terms of the Northern Rebellion, really rather successfully. Further consequences we see again is this idea of this brutal kind of crackdown from Elizabeth. She declared martial law, and there was this terrible retribution against the ordinary folks of the Yorkshire Dales. And despite a lack of any real support from the Earls for the rising, she demanded at least 700 executions. And again, here we see Elizabeth is kind of responses may being a little over the top. The people being executed were described to be wholly of the meanest sort of people. There was hardly a village that escaped without the sight of a public hanging. And so Elizabeth is here seemingly very strongly making a point that this was that she was not to be trifled with, that royal power in the north would be obeyed. In 1570, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth, but the document didn't arrive until the rebellion had been suppressed. The bull gave Elizabeth more reason to view Catholics with suspicion, and maybe in some ways it explains her ongoing brutality in the north as she re-established her power and control. It is important to note that the Northern Rebellion wasn't the only rebellion in Elizabeth's reign. We've looked at the Tyrone Rebellion already, and this again stemmed from a mixture of desire to remove English rule, religion, socio-economic issues, and Tyrone's own ambition. Essex Rebellion really is connected to the Tyrone Rebellion, as in is connected to his failure to deal with it, and there are some suggestions from sources and things like that there was a degree of collusion between Essex and Tyrone. Now, Essex is spurred into rebellion not only due to his own failure in Ireland, but his failure to match Robert Cecil in building a strong faction to compete not only for standing with Elizabeth, but also connections with James, who was in all likelihood going to be the next king. He believed that he was wildly popular with the population across England, in particular in London, but his rebellion received very little support, and that the public remained loyal to Elizabeth. And so Essex Rebellion, though dangerous, it involves a kind of a very notable and had been very senior member of Elizabeth's government rebelling. He does it in London, so the location is significant as well. It's towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, where maybe some of the kind of the height of her powers and her popularity have waned to a degree. But even in these circumstances, Elizabeth holds strong. The population remain with her. So there is discontent and rebellion, but Elizabeth copes with it admirably, though often rather brutally. In terms of assessing society under Elizabeth, then clearly there are issues with social discontent in Elizabeth's reign, which are highlighted by, for example, various measures set out to deal with poverty, both helping the poor and punishing the poor for vagrancy and various other things, and refusing to accept wages. And again, I'll look at more of that in the economic bit, but that clearly underlines the fact that there were economic issues which did lead to discontent. And so we aren't talking about a period where all the people in England were wonderfully happy, although we have kind of golden age of Elizabeth and all that kind of stuff. But there is variety across society, in particular because of this increasing gap between rich and poor. So the nobility, and particularly the gentry, are having a great old time, and they're getting wealthier and wealthier. But a lot of the poor are getting desperately poor during this period. Elizabethan society was both volatile and vibrant, in part due to the fact that the population was so much younger on average than modern society today. This was a society full of young people who would act as you would expect young people to do, and so in that we see a degree of volatility, but we also see a kind of a vibrancy to English society. The population was also growing incredibly quickly, and this also brought significant change and challenges with it. A huge pressure on the production of food, and when bad harvests came, their impact was hugely significant. Again, we talked about this tension between the rich and the poor as the gap grew bigger, but the fact that the wealthy were largely moving out of fortified castles to comfortable country houses, which weren't actually defendable, shows that maybe law and order are improving, and maybe the tensions in society have been perhaps exaggerated. Any exam questions you get are likely to focus, because of the key question, on the ideas of continuity and change. So, for example, there's been on one, England was transformed both economically and socially in the last 20 years of Elizabeth's reign. Assess the validity of this view. And in terms of the social bit of that, you would look at things like the changes in society. You would look at the potential increase in tension between those higher up in society and those lower down, the emergence and growth of the growth of the gentry class. You would talk about the changes across the regions. You particularly, again, I would highlight issues and changes in Ireland. You need to be careful with questions like that because it says the last 20 years of her reign. So if it's the last, so in that, if you start talking about things like the Northern Rebellion, then obviously you're going back too far. So you have to be careful what you pick, and in particular, I think things like that would pick up on issues like poverty and inflation, a lot of which will come in the economics video. But there is definitely an argument about the degree of social change that is taking place. There's an awful lot where English society looks very much like it had done before. There is other stuff that's changing with massive growth in population, big growing the gap between rich and poor. We're seeing some of the bits that society had rested on for supporting that, like the monasteries are now well and truly gone. We're seeing other elements where we're seeing a growth in towns and particularly a huge growth in London. Right. I hope that's been helpful. If it has been, please hit like. There's lots of other videos in this playlist to help you with the Tudor unit, but there's also lots on the channel to help with other history units. There's also a huge amount of stuff for A-level politics. If you do that as well, check those out. If you haven't subscribed already, then please do. Any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thank you very much for watching.